This excerpt is taken from the introduction of the book Everyday Occupation, American Soldiers and Chinese Civilians After World War II, Cambridge University Press, November 272025 by Chunmei Du, Associate Professor at Lingnan University, Hong Kong. Footnotes omitted. The introduction provides historical and theoretical framings for this book. It situates the American military presence in post-war China within two interconnected contexts of China's Civil War confrontations and America's global occupation. It engages with existing historiographies by locating China in the American Empire and locating America in communist propaganda. Through the microlens of the everyday, it also analyzes the actual and critical links between grassroots frictions and Sino-US relations. Authorized by the author for publication. Chunmei Du Everyday Encounter. Introduction of Everyday Occupation, American Soldiers and Chinese Civilians After World War II. Nanjing, Christmas Day, 1946. General George C. Marshall, U.S. Special Envoy to China, was attending a concert organized by his hospitable nationalist hosts in the capital when his Jeep with the special, USA 205936333, plate went missing. As it turned out, the Jeep was stolen by a local thief who quickly turned it on the thriving black market. One Chinese critic called the Jeep incident an omen and allegory of the American failure in China. 1 However, it was not just the failure of Marshall's mediation in the Chinese Civil War, or even the failure of U.S. policy in China at large, but also America's failure to sustain the image of a good and special ally just a little more than 1 year after winning World War II. 1 day earlier, and more than 600 miles to the north, in the ancient capital of Beijing, Peiping. 19-year-old college student Shen Chong had been raped by an intoxicated U.S. Marine. Nationwide protests broke out over the next few days, calling for severe punishment of the American rapist and the complete withdrawal of the U.S. military from China. But as we zoom in to the actual scene of the protest, GI spectators inside a locked compound were spotted joining outside protesters, who were shouting, "Get out of China, Gun Chu Zhonghua," by shouting back, "I want to go home." The exchange of these messages, steeped in emotions, reveals a highly volatile and ultimately defining moment in Sino-US history that is often called the loss of China. 3. Everyday Occupation provides a microhistory of the quotidian encounters between American soldiers and Chinese civilians and their entangled relations from the end of World War II to the founding of the People's Republic of China. Drawing upon official, popular, and personal accounts from both countries, it focuses on the sensorial, material, and symbolic exchanges between GIs and ordinary Chinese people, pedestrians, rickshaw pullers, suspected thieves, stall vendors, and the Jeep girls, Jipu Nulang, who were seen as fraternizing with U.S. soldiers. Through the microlens of the everyday, this book reveals how grassroots interactions affected larger political dynamics during a critical era in Sino-American relations. I argue that ostensibly mundane matters such as traffic accidents, sexual relations, theft, and black market dealings provide a key to understanding the intensity and longevity of popular Chinese anti-American sentiment, as the abstract concepts of imperialism and sovereignty became legible in the common language of life and death, gain and loss, and fairness and injustice. Meanwhile, American servicemen and Chinese civilians engaged in a form of informal diplomacy, developing new tastes, languages, consumption habits, and identities, as well as individual and institutional bonds, all of which left a lasting imprint on both countries. Shortly after the Jeep incident, General Marshall, newly appointed Secretary of State, declared the end of his peace mission in China and returned to the United States in January 1947. As President Harry S. Truman's special representative, Marshall had spent a trying year in China, working tirelessly to end civil strife and bring about political unification. The Truman administration aimed to limit Soviet influence in the country by forcing the ruling nationalists and the rival Chinese Communist Party, CCP, into a coalition government under Chiang Kai-shek's leadership. On January 10, 1946, Marshall succeeded in securing acceptance of a ceasefire agreement, and an executive headquarters was set up in Beijing to supervise the truce, led by 3 commissioners representing the United States, the nationalist government, and the CCP. However, the resulting resolutions quickly broke down as both sides violated the ceasefire and fought over the strategically important region of Manchuria. Full-scale civil war broke out in June. To pressure Chiang to become more compliant in the peace negotiations, the U.S. imposed a 10-month arms embargo from August 1946, and a U.S. financial loan was also put on ice. In November, Chiang Kai-shek unilaterally convened the National Assembly, but both the CCP and the Democratic League refused to participate. By the spring of 1947, the nationalists were in a dire predicament. The tide on the battleground was shifting as the CCP went on counteroffensives. The huge gap between government expenditure and income continued to increase, and the solution of printing money led to record high inflation and devastating consequences for the urban economy. Facing increasing social unrest and widespread student protests, the government cracked down on communist infiltration and banned leftist publications and organizations. The military, economic, and political crises deepened throughout 1948, and on all major fronts the Nationalist Party lost public trust and legitimacy. Despite the considerable advantages it held over the Communists at the end of World War II, the Nationalist Party was defeated in the Civil War that concluded in 1949.4. In world history, the immediate post-war era is celebrated for the victory against fascism and the beginning of post-war occupation and reconstruction. It is also known for the emerging Cold War conflict between the two superpowers that were directly involved in China's post-war struggle. On August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and attacked Japanese forces in Manchuria, following its pledge at the Yalta Conference. The Soviet forces treated the Japanese with little mercy, plundered Manchurian war booty valued at well over $800 million, and secretly aided Chinese communists by sending arms and supplies. Moreover, they tried to maintain a physical presence in China. On August 14, the day before Japan's surrender, the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Alliance was signed by the Soviet Union and the nationalist government. The pact included the agreement that for 30 years, Lushuan, Port Arthur, would be a naval base used jointly by China and the Soviet Union, and Dalian, Dairen, would be a free port granting the Soviets privileged access rights. As a result, the Soviet military occupied these two strategic ports, securing advantageous positioning in the Asia-Pacific region. The full withdrawal of its forces from Manchuria, supposed to be completed within weeks, was delayed several times and not finalized until early May 1946. Even then, the Soviets continued to maintain a presence in both ports until the mid-1950s. The U.S. occupation of North China occurred in the intertwining of these two crucial contexts. The internal tension culminating in a civil war and the global expansion of the U.S. empire in the emerging Cold War. 7 Fearing that the Chinese Communists and Soviets would fill the void left by Japan's surrender, America acted quickly. In September 1945, more than 50,000 Marines of the III Amphibian Corps, IIIAC, were sent from the Pacific to North China for a new mission codenamed Operation Beleaguer. Its key occupation duties included accepting Japanese surrenders, repatriating more than 3 million Japanese soldiers and civilians, transporting 500,000 nationalist troops to North and Central China, and liberating and rehabilitating Allied internees and prisoners of war. 8 The IIIAC elements, including the 1st Marine Division and the 6th Marine Division, together with naval forces from the 7th Fleet and the U.S. Military Advisory Group, formed the bulk of the U.S. troops in China after World War II. At the peak of the U.S. military deployment, 113,000 American soldiers were stationed in China for various duties, expanding their presence from the wartime hinterland to areas formerly occupied by the Japanese. 9 While certain Marine units were assigned to remote outposts in North China and Manchuria, American military personnel were concentrated in China's major political, economic, and cultural centers, Beijing, Nanjing, Qingdao, Shanghai, and Tianjin. There they lived in city centers rather than separate camp towns and came into close contact with all types of Chinese people going about their daily lives, a major difference from their wartime predecessors who had been housed in designated hostels provided by the nationalist government. The nature of the mission also changed. American servicemen, including both veterans and new recruits, were no longer engaged in combat operations against Japanese forces like those who came before them. Instead, they participated in a variety of new activities, from occupation duties to humanitarian assistance and peacemaking. This shift marked a new stage for U.S. military personnel's interactions with Chinese society, expanding their engagement with local populations in roles and capacities beyond traditional wartime functions. But ultimately, the mission's ambiguous, vague, and sometimes conflicting objectives, such as assisting the nationalist government while maintaining neutrality in the midst of an escalating civil war, made it a mission impossible to execute or succeed. Despite the initial warm welcome extended in post-war China by locals who had suffered for years under Japanese rule, anti-American sentiment quickly developed in response to seemingly trivial incidents involving traffic accidents, sexual relations, and American goods. Rampant misconduct among American soldiers, coupled with systemic inequalities that pervaded individual and institutional interactions, provided fertile ground for grassroots frictions. Nationwide demonstrations broke out in the wake of the Peking rape incident, leading to the hitherto largest anti-American movement in Chinese history. 10 The CCP seized upon the growing animosity and launched a major propaganda campaign against the continued presence of U.S. military forces in China, American aid to the nationalists that prolonged the Civil War, and U.S. imperialism in the world. By linking American imperialists with the reactionary nationalist regime that acted as its running dog, the campaign contributed to the communist victory, especially in advancing its political cause among urban populations. In hindsight, it is tempting to see this historic encounter between U.S. servicemen and Chinese civilians as a doomed failure. The late 1940s marked a turning point in Chinese perceptions of America. Deep appreciation and gratitude turned into grievances and animosity, and public sentiment shifted from pro-America, Chunmei, to anti-America, Fan Mei. 11 According to a Time magazine report, American imperialism had replaced both Japanese imperialism and British imperialism in the average Chinese intellectual's dictionary of opprobrium, and street urchins in Shanghai's alleys sang the little rhyme of Mei Kuo Lao, Chen Piu Hao, American fellows are really no good. 12 While previous research has demonstrated the significant impact of U.S. imperialism and communist propaganda on this transition, viewing these unprecedented grassroots exchanges only through the prism of political domination and manipulation risks overlooking individual agency and historical contingencies. We also missed the opportunity to investigate how these two large political forces worked in relation to the messy world of mundane struggles. For example, how did the U.S. system of law and justice fail in China despite its ideals of liberalism and realpolitik in the early Cold War environment? How did the communist anti-American campaign manage to attract such a broad spectrum of supporters, ranging from outspoken leftists and liberal intellectuals to students, businessmen, and the urban poor? Moreover, what kinds of roles did Chinese individuals and American servicemen play in the nexus of Sino-U.S. relations and everyday frictions? Answering these questions is crucial for understanding the post-war U.S. global empire, the rise of Chinese anti-American nationalism, and the making and unmaking of Sino-U.S. relations during a watershed moment in history. It also provides valuable lessons for today, when the world is once again caught in polarized ideological confrontations and nationalist conflicts. Uneven reciprocity, locating China in the U.S. empire. The years from 1945 to 1949 will go down in Chinese history as the American period, stated Graham Peck, a seasoned traveler who served with the U.S. Office of War Information in China throughout the 1940s. This was evident as former U.S. Army vehicles, uniforms, and arms became most conspicuous across the country, with military advisors active in the capital, warships patrolling the seacoast, and military planes frequently flying over the interior. 13 The United States after World War II, with its enormous soft and hard powers in both territorial and non-territorial forms, includes a crucial military dimension, what many scholars call an empire of bases. 14 The critical lens of empire provides a powerful framework for analyzing the U.S. military in China, and it is essential to link its presence with that in other areas colonized, occupied, and stationed by America. In particular, power asymmetries embedded in Sino-US interactions at the national and individual levels were similar to those in occupied Japan and Korea, despite dramatic differences in political status and circumstances. Contemporary Chinese critics already compared GIs in China to the occupying forces in Japan, warning that the US was treating China as a colony. The U.S. military's policy perpetuated systemic racism and injustice against Chinese civilians in their policing and judicial process, and American servicemen expressed Orientalist views, held racist and sexist attitudes toward Chinese elites and commoners, and enjoyed immunity from local laws. In his recent book The Tormented Alliance, Zach Fredman convincingly shows the prevalence of GI misconduct and the unequal relationship imposed by U.S. imperialism on China throughout the 1940s. However, framing grassroots interactions with the Chinese, including frictions, solely through the lens of brutal, everyday racism of imperialism, does not adequately account for the complex nature of the U.S. military involvement and modes of domination in post-war China. 15. Unlike its East Asian neighbors under U.S. occupation and the Philippines, a former colony and later client state, China was an ally and a sovereign nation. Officially, GIs were invited guests of the nationalist government, a status that was not in name only. For example, despite their critical contributions to the war effort and an initial plan to send them, black troops, in deference to the Chinese government's racist requests, were not stationed in post-war Chinese cities. 16 Since World War II, the American military had tried to educate its soldiers to respect the Chinese as civilized equals, while American propaganda celebrated China and its people with flattering portrayals. 17 In the precarious environment of the Civil War between the nationalist and communist parties, the American government promoted a liberal image of itself as a benevolent leader of the world, in contrast to the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, it promulgated the economic agenda of a free world economy based on the open market and free trade, secured favorable terms for American businesses and investors, and enabled further domination through various instruments of influence. In principle, the U.S. government intended to showcase democracy and provide a blueprint for a future liberal China. This projected sense of equality and fairness was crucial to the legitimacy of the expanding empire in the early Cold War era. 18 Back home, the new American middlebrow intellectual representations highlighted mutually beneficial exchanges between Americans and Asians, within a system of reciprocity. 19 In China, U.S. strategic objectives called for appeasement of rising anti-American sentiment among the Chinese, which the U.S. actually attempted, and it was reluctant to directly intervene in the Civil War. This peculiar power dynamic affected how U.S. imperialism worked in China and shaped the inner workings of the Sino-American partnership. The everyday interactions, especially conflicts, between American servicemen and Chinese civilians embodied the power struggles between the two governments. The nationalist government held an ambivalent and often conflicting attitude on the issue of U.S. occupation. On the one hand, it hoped to prolong the U.S. military's stay during the Civil War and remain dependent on U.S. assistance, and on the other hand, it was resistant to foreign encroachment on Chinese sovereignty. As the Generalissimo declared victory against Japan and embarked on post-war reconstruction after 8 years of devastating war, China claimed unprecedented national pride and a leading role in the region and even the world. 20 The country embraced its new international status as one of the Big Four nations, along with Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, and became one of the 5 permanent members of the newly established United Nations Security Council. Known for his sensitivity regarding national equality, Chiang flagged unequal treaties as a national humiliation that hampered nationalist efforts to build a nation and acclaimed their removal as the start of a new epoch in history and the most important page in Chinese history. 21 The nationalist government took sovereignty seriously and referred to U.S. military activities in China as presence, zhuhua. Rather than occupation, the term used by the U.S. military for its mission in North China. The government was also careful in not setting legal precedents for other foreign countries. For example, although the U.S. Navy saw Qingdao as a potential permanent naval base and used the port as a major fleet anchorage in the Far East until 1949, no formal written agreement on stationing U.S. naval vessels at China ports is known to exist, as the Chinese government desired to avoid written agreements of this nature. 22 Such a lack of formal agreements with clearly defined terms regarding the U.S. military presence in China often led to unrealistic expectations, inconsistent assumptions, and disappointing outcomes on both sides. Unfinished. For the full text, please visit Substack.